My dad called me a burden, then toasted my brother. Then CNN cut in. You ever have one of those moments where the world just kind of blurs? Like you're standing right there, physically present, but everything around you gets hazy, the sounds muffled, the faces indistinct? Yeah, that was me. It was supposed to be a celebration, a big family shindig, 100 or so of our closest and not-so-closest relatives packed into the Stone family estate. The air thick with expensive perfume, clinking glasses, and the low hum of forced conviviality. My dad, Arthur Stone, patriarch of the illustrious Stone lineage, stood at the head of the impossibly long dining table, a glass of something amber and expensive held aloft. The spotlight, as always, was on Liam, my brother, the golden child, the prodigal son who had not only returned but had returned triumphant, laden with accolades and business deals that apparently brought honor to the Stone name. Dad's voice, usually a booming force that commanded attention, softened just a touch as he spoke of Liam, a proud tremor in his words, a sentiment echoed by every single one of those 100-odd people whose eyes were fixed on the golden boy, their smiles wide and approving. Then, just as the collective applause began to swell, a lull in the orchestrated celebration, he turned his gaze, or rather, his glance, in my direction. It wasn't a look of recognition, not even a fleeting acknowledgement of my presence as his daughter, but more like an afterthought, a dismissive flick of the wrist. Her choices, he declared, his voice regaining its usual booming resonance, but now laced with a thinly veiled contempt, are her burden, not mine. The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp, slicing through the remnants of festive cheer. And then, they laughed. Not a sympathetic chuckle, not an awkward cough, but a full-throated, unrestrained wave of laughter that washed over me, a chorus of amusement at my expense. It felt like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left me breathless, hollowed out. I stood there, rooted to the spot, a silent statue amidst the merriment, my own personal world shattering around me, each shard reflecting back a distorted image of a girl who was nothing more than a burden, an inconvenience, a failure in the grand tapestry of the Stone family. The sounds, the smells, the vibrant colors of the party faded into a dull, gray monochrome. It wasn't just the words, though they were certainly a venomous sting. It was the casual dismissal, the effortless way he had reduced my entire existence, my aspirations, my struggles, to a mere footnote, a liability he was eager to disown. And the laughter, oh, the laughter. It echoed in the cavernous halls of my mind, a mocking symphony that seemed to seal my fate, to solidify my place as the family outcast, the one who didn't quite fit, the one who always chose the wrong path. I felt a familiar ache blooming in my chest, a cold, empty sensation that had become an unwelcome companion over the years. This wasn't the first time, of course, not by a long shot, but each instance, each public slight, each casual cruelty, chipped away a little more at whatever fragile sense of self-worth I had managed to cling to. Liam, oblivious or perhaps willfully ignorant, continued to bask in the glow of adoration, his charming smile unwavering, his hand on my father's shoulder, a picture of filial devotion and success. And well, I was just the shadow in the corner, the one whose very presence served as a stark reminder of all that was supposedly wrong with the Stone family, according to my father's rigid, unyielding standards. The silence that followed his words, before the laughter erupted, was deafening, pregnant with unspoken judgment. It felt like every single person in that room was staring at me, dissecting me, confirming my father's assessment. My stomach twisted into knots, a cold dread seeping into my bones. All I wanted was to disappear, to vanish into thin air, to escape the suffocating weight of their collective gaze, their knowing smirks. But I couldn't. I was trapped, a willing participant in my own public humiliation, an unwilling recipient of a father's disdain, broadcast for all to hear, for all to witness. And as I stood there, a numb emptiness spreading through me, I realized something chilling. This wasn't just a moment of public shame. It was a reaffirmation of a truth I had always known, a truth whispered in the quiet corners of my mind, amplified by the cacophony of their laughter. In my father's eyes, I was, and always would be, a burden. The ringing in my ears from their laughter was slowly starting to subside, replaced by the dull throb of a migraine that was brewing behind my eyes. I was still standing there, a ghost in my own home, trying to figure out how to simply exist without drawing more attention to myself, when the sound system, which had been piping a carefully curated playlist of classical music throughout the sprawling estate, suddenly cut out. It was a jarring silence, a momentary disruption in the meticulously planned celebration, and for a split second, everyone in the room seemed to pause, mid-conversation, mid-chew, mid-sip. Then, with a faint click, the massive outdoor television screen, usually reserved for sporting events or ambient visuals, flickered to life. My father, still holding his now trembling crystal glass, had been about to resume his beaming conversation with Liam, but his voice, along with everyone else's, died in his throat. The screen, which had been displaying some picturesque, generic landscape, abruptly switched. The familiar, urgent chime of a news bulletin pierced the air, and suddenly, the familiar CNN logo flashed across the top. My stomach lurched, a cold wave of apprehension washing over me. This wasn't part of the program. This wasn't a pre-planned interlude. This was unexpected. My eyes, still stinging from unshed tears, focused on the screen, and then I saw it. My own face. It was a formal portrait, a headshot really, but not the one my mother insisted on using for our family Christmas cards, the one where I'm smiling sweetly in a pastel dress. No, this was a different me. This was my face, but sharper, more defined, framed by the rigid lines of a military uniform, complete with rank insignia I recognized all too well. For a second, I thought it was some kind of cruel joke, a twisted prank orchestrated by someone who knew just how much I dreaded being the center of attention, especially in this family. But then the bold, white text scrolled across the bottom of the screen, a news ticker that seemed to burn itself into my vision. Major General Riley Stone, 33, strategic genius behind global AI counteroffensive. My breath hitched. The words were there, undeniable, stark against the backdrop of my uniformed self. General. Major General. Not just a rank, but that rank at this age. And then the second part, the real kicker. Strategic genius behind global AI counteroffensive. The sheer weight of those words, the gravity of their meaning, hit me like a physical force. The silence in the room wasn't just deafening, it was suffocating. The jovial murmur of conversation had completely vanished, replaced by a collective, stunned gasp. Every single one of those 100-odd eyes that had just moments ago been fixed on Liam, or had been laughing at me, were now riveted to the screen, and then, slowly, disbelievingly, they turned to me. I could feel their gazes, sharp and sudden, dissecting me in a new light. The air grew thick with unspoken questions, with the dawning realization of what this meant. My father, his face pale, looked like he'd seen a ghost. The crystal glass, which he had been holding so confidently, now trembled visibly in his hand, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor that spoke volumes. The amber liquid inside sloshed precariously, threatening to spill over the rim. His jaw, which had been set in a self-satisfied smirk just seconds before, had gone slack, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and something that looked suspiciously like shock? Or was it disbelief? No, it was more profound than that. It was as if his entire meticulously constructed world, a world where I was merely a burden, had just been irrevocably, spectacularly, imploded by a single news headline. I could feel the shift in the room, a palpable change in the atmosphere. The laughter that had echoed moments ago was now a distant, hollow memory, replaced by a stunned, almost reverent hush. Liam, who had been preening under my father's praise, now stood frozen, his perfect smile a little crooked, his eyes darting between the screen and me, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. The sheer irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Just seconds after being publicly branded a burden, a failure, an inconvenient truth, the entire world, or at least a significant portion of it via a global news network, was declaring me a strategic genius. The contrast was so stark, so absurd, that a strange, almost manic, urge to laugh bubbled up within me. But I didn't. I just stood there, letting the silence, the stares, the sudden, seismic shift in the room wash over me, a silent, defiant testament to the fact that sometimes, the world has a funny way of proving people wrong, even when those people are your own family. The trembling of my father's glass continued, a small but significant detail that spoke volumes about the unexpected upheaval this simple news bulletin had brought to his carefully orchestrated reality. The sudden shift in the room was almost comical, if it hadn't been so utterly jarring. The hushed whispers that followed the CNN broadcast were laced with a mixture of awe and confusion, replacing the earlier patronizing chuckles. It was like watching a perfectly choreographed dance suddenly veer off course, everyone scrambling to find their new positions. But even with the attention momentarily diverted, my gaze drifted, almost instinctively, to the fireplace mantel. In our family, that mantel wasn't just a decorative shelf. It was a shrine, a meticulously curated display of Stone family achievements, and for as long as I could remember, it had been almost exclusively Liam's domain. Every trophy he'd ever won, Every certificate of academic excellence, every photograph commemorating his triumphs. They were all there, polished and perfectly aligned, catching the light just so. There was his high school football MVP award, his diploma from some Ivy League university I couldn't even name anymore, a framed photo of him shaking hands with a vaguely recognizable CEO. It was a testament to his relentless pursuit of conventional success, a visual representation of everything my father held dear. And for a few fleeting years, nestled almost apologetically among Liam's grandeur, there had been one of my own. A simple, unframed photograph from my airborne school graduation. I remembered the day vividly. The sweat, the grit, the sheer exhaustion, and then the overwhelming pride as I received my wings. It wasn't glamorous, not in the way Liam's achievements were, but it was mine, earned through sheer force of will and a burning desire to prove something, even if I wasn't entirely sure to whom. I placed it there myself, after a particularly pointed comment from my father about my unconventional career choices, a silent challenge, a tiny rebellion in a house that demanded conformity. It had always felt a little out of place, a rough-hewn stone amidst polished jewels, but it was there. Or, rather, it had been there. Now, as my eyes scanned the familiar landscape of Liam's triumphs, a cold knot formed in my stomach. My photo. It was gone. Not just moved, not just slightly askew, but entirely, unequivocally missing. In its place, gleaming under the soft glow of the recessed lighting, was a new addition, a meticulously framed, impossibly glossy photograph of Liam, standing beside a distinguished-looking senator, both of them beaming, an aura of political power and influence radiating from the image. It was the kind of picture that screamed, future, important man. The sudden absence of my own small victory, amplified by the fresh, polished presence of Liam's latest triumph, felt like a deliberate erasure. It wasn't just a missing photograph. It was a confirmation of my diminished status, a visual declaration that my achievements, whatever they were, didn't belong in the hallowed halls of Stone family glory. Just as the realization solidified into a painful certainty, my mother, ever the watchful guardian of appearances, glided over to me, a practiced, almost too sweet smile on her face. Her eyes, usually so sharp and discerning, seemed to deliberately avoid the mantelpiece. "Oh, that old thing," she chirped, her voice light, dismissive. "I just tidied it away, dear. It was gathering dust. Gathering dust." The words hung in the air, dripping with an almost casual cruelty. Not, "I moved it," or "I put it somewhere safe," but gathering dust. As if my years of dedication, the literal blood, sweat, and tears, had amounted to nothing more than an unsightly accumulation of grime. It was a thinly veiled excuse, a polite dismissal of my entire career, my entire existence outside of their carefully constructed narrative for me. It was a familiar tactic, the subtle, undermining remark delivered with a smile, designed to make you question your own perception, to make you feel like you were overreacting, that it was your fault for even noticing. But I noticed. I always noticed. The truth of her words, or rather, the lie embedded within them, settled heavily in my chest. It wasn't about dust. It was about narrative control, about maintaining the perfect, pristine image of the Stone family, an image where only Liam's successes were worthy of display, where my own unconventional path was to be swept under the rug, out of sight, out of mind. The CNN broadcast might have momentarily shattered their illusion, but here, in the quiet, insidious removal of a single photograph, was the true, enduring reality of my place in this family. I was still the burden, the anomaly, the one whose achievements were, quite literally, considered dust, the muted shock that had settled over the gathering after the CNN broadcast lingered, a thick, palpable tension that even my mother's forced cheer couldn't dissipate. As the immediate aftermath began to subside, replaced by hushed, curious murmurs and stolen glances in my direction, I felt an almost magnetic pull towards the quieter, forgotten corners of the house. The overwhelming desire to escape the suffocating weight of their suddenly shifted perceptions, the stares that now held an uncomfortable mix of awe and bewilderment instead of condescension, was overpowering. My feet, seemingly of their own accord, led me away from the opulent main floor, past the grand staircase where countless family portraits stared down with unblinking eyes, and up the narrow, seldom-used servant stairs that led to the attic. The attic of the Stone estate was a vast, cavernous space, a dusty repository of forgotten treasures and discarded memories. It smelled of old wood, mothballs, and the faint, sweet scent of decay. Shafts of sunlight, thick with dancing motes of dust, streamed through the grimy skylights, illuminating stacks of antique furniture draped in white sheets, boxes overflowing with outdated holiday decorations, and trunks filled with forgotten finery. I walked slowly, deliberately, my senses on high alert, as if searching for something I didn't even know was missing. And then, tucked away in a dimly lit corner, partially obscured by an old, moth-eaten tapestry, I saw it. A plain, cardboard box, surprisingly small amidst the larger, more ornate containers. What drew my attention wasn't its size or its obscurity, but the familiar, almost aggressively neat handwriting scrawled across its side in thick, black marker. Riley's Things. It was my father's handwriting, unmistakable in its precise, almost clinical neatness. A chilling wave washed over me. Riley's Things. Not Riley's memories, or Riley's accomplishments. Just things. As if my life, my experiences, could be reduced to an impersonal collection of discarded objects. With a strange sense of dread mixed with a morbid curiosity, I pulled the box out from its hiding place. It was lighter than I expected, and as I lifted the lid, a cloud of fine dust puffed into the stale air. What I saw inside wasn't just a collection of items. It was a museum of neglect, a stark, painful testament to a complete and utter dismissal of everything I had ever strived for, everything I had ever achieved. There was no tissue paper, no protective wrapping, no indication of care or sentimentality. Everything was simply crammed in, crumpled, and neglected. The first thing my fingers brushed against was something cold and metallic. I pulled it out, and it was my first marathon medal, the one I'd trained for months to earn, the one that represented pushing past my physical and mental limits. It was tarnished, the ribbon crumpled, shoved in haphazardly as if it were a piece of trash. Next, I pulled out a familiar, faded piece of fabric, a green beret. Not just any beret, but the one my grandfather, a decorated veteran, had given me when I first joined up, a symbol of heritage and pride that he'd passed down with solemn reverence. It was now squashed flat, folded incorrectly, its proud shape utterly ruined. Beneath that, almost as an afterthought, was a piece of paper, laminated but still creased and dog-eared, a letter of commendation from Afghanistan. The official seal, the formal language praising my exceptional courage and strategic foresight during a particularly dangerous mission, meant nothing to them, apparently. It was just another piece of paper, shoved in without a second thought. And finally, at the very bottom, buried beneath the crumpled metal and the flattened beret, was a pristine certificate, boldly declaring me Soldier of the Year from my unit. It was bent almost in half, a harsh crease running right through the center, as if someone had just casually tossed it in without even unfolding it. Each item, in its state of disarray and neglect, screamed a truth more profound and more painful than any shouted accusation. This wasn't just a box of old mementos. It was a physical manifestation of my father's disdain, a chillingly accurate representation of how he truly viewed my life's work, my sacrifices, my very identity. None of these things, which had meant so much to me, which represented years of dedication and hardship, had been placed with care, or even with a shred of respect. They were simply dumped, out of sight, out of mind, in a dusty corner of the attic, just like I had been, for so long, in the grand narrative of the Stone family. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. The world might be calling me a strategic genius, but in this silent, dusty attic, I was still just Riley's Things, a collection of inconvenient achievements swept away to gather dust. The dust from the Riley's Things box still clung to my uniform, a gritty reminder of how little my efforts meant in the grand scheme of the Stone family. The bitter taste of that discovery lingered, a raw, exposed nerve. It wasn't just the physical neglect of my achievements. It was the symbolic weight of it all, the clear message that my path, my struggles, my very identity, were deemed irrelevant, disposable. And yet, despite that gnawing emptiness, a part of me, the foolish, hopeful part, had always clung to the idea that at least on some fundamental level, I was still contributing, still helping. For years, ever since I first started earning a decent military salary, a significant portion of my paychecks had been automatically wired home. It wasn't a grand gesture, not meant to be, but a quiet, consistent act of support. I imagined it being used for practical things, the mundane necessities that kept a household running. I pictured my mother, with her perpetually worried lines around her eyes, finally being able to buy the organic produce she always fretted about, without having to pinch pennies. I envisioned my father, whose complaints about the deteriorating state of the family estate were legendary, finally getting around to fixing that creaky, rotting front porch that had been an eyesore for a decade. Maybe it would go towards a new water heater, or a fresh coat of paint for the study, or even just a few extra comforts that would ease their daily burdens. It was a silent pact I had made with myself, a way to feel connected, to feel useful, even from thousands of miles away, even when the phone calls were infrequent and the conversation stilted. I told myself it was for them, for the family, for the upkeep of the home I rarely visited but still, in some deeply ingrained part of me, considered my own. Then, a few weeks before this disastrous family gathering, my mother called. Her voice, usually a carefully modulated blend of polite indifference and subtle complaint, was unusually bright, almost giddy. It was a rare occurrence, and a flicker of genuine warmth, of foolish hope, sparked within me. Maybe the porch was finally fixed. Maybe they'd bought that new appliance she'd been hinting at for years. I braced myself for a cheerful update, ready to share in their small victory. "Riley, darling," she practically chirped, and I could almost hear the smile in her voice, a stark contrast to the usual weary sigh. "Oh, I just had to tell you, your last transfer, it came at the perfect time. We used it for Liam's new Armani suit." The words hit me like a physical blow, a sudden, sharp intake of breath that left my lungs burning. Armani. For Liam. My mind reeled, trying to process the disconnect, the sheer, audacious audacity of it. Armani. I managed to croak, the single word barely a whisper. "Yes, darling, Armani," she continued, oblivious to the sudden chill that had permeated my end of the line. "He simply had to look impeccable for that networking event in New York. You know, the one with Senator Thompson and those venture capitalists? He couldn't possibly go in anything less than the best, and your timing was just divine. It fit him like a glove, absolutely exquisite. He looked so distinguished, so stone." She chuckled, a light, airy sound that grated on my ears. "He's already made such wonderful connections, darling. This is going to be huge for his career, truly huge for the family name." My heart, which had been a dull, aching throb since the mantelpiece revelation, now felt like it was being physically ripped apart. It wasn't just the money, though that was a significant amount, money I had earned through long, grueling deployments, through risking my life in places most people only saw on the news. It was the absolute, unadulterated betrayal of my trust, of my intentions, of the quiet sacrifices I had made. All those years, all those transfers, all those mental images of groceries and repairs and practical necessities, they had been a delusion, a fantasy. My hard-earned money, money that could have gone to actual needs, to easing their burdens, had instead been funneled into Liam's meticulously crafted image, into a superficial display of wealth and status that served only to further his already privileged trajectory. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste on my tongue. I was out there, in the dust and the danger, fighting for what exactly? So Liam could wear an expensive suit to a networking event? So he could look impeccable, while I was covered in grit and grime, making choices that were my burden, not theirs? The sheer, unthinking selfishness of it was breathtaking. My mother's cheerful voice continued to chatter about Liam's promising future, about the honor he was bringing to the family, completely oblivious, or perhaps willfully ignorant, of the chasm that had just opened up between us. My heart didn't just break. It shattered into a million tiny pieces, each one reflecting back the painful truth. I wasn't just a burden. I was a resource, a means to an end, a convenient ATM for Liam's ascent, my own needs and sacrifices utterly invisible, utterly irrelevant. The phone call ended, and I stood there, the receiver still pressed to my ear, listening to the hollow dial tone, the sound echoing the emptiness that had just consumed me. The dust from the Riley's Things box still clung to my uniform, a gritty reminder of how little my efforts meant in the grand scheme of the Stone family. The bitter taste of that discovery lingered, a raw, exposed nerve. It wasn't just the physical neglect of my achievements. It was the symbolic weight of it all, the clear message that my path, my struggles, my very identity, were deemed irrelevant, disposable. And yet, despite that gnawing emptiness, a part of me, the foolish, hopeful part, had always clung to the idea that at least on some fundamental level, I was still contributing, still helping. For years, ever since I first started earning a decent military salary, a significant portion of my paychecks had been automatically wired home. It wasn't a grand gesture, not meant to be, but a quiet, consistent act of support. I imagined it being used for practical things, the mundane necessities that kept a household running. I pictured my mother, with her perpetually worried lines around her eyes, finally being able to buy the organic produce she always fretted about, without having to pinch pennies. I envisioned my father, whose complaints about the deteriorating state of the family estate were legendary, finally getting around to fixing that creaky, rotting front porch that had been an eyesore for a decade. Maybe it would go towards a new water heater, or a fresh coat of paint for the study, or even just a few extra comforts that would ease their daily burdens. It was a silent pact I had made with myself, a way to feel connected, to feel useful, even from thousands of miles away, even when the phone calls were infrequent and the conversation stilted. I told myself it was for them, for the family, for the upkeep of the home I rarely visited but still, in some deeply ingrained part of me, considered my own. Then, a few weeks before this disastrous family gathering, my mother called. Her voice, usually a carefully modulated blend of polite indifference and subtle complaint, was unusually bright, almost giddy. It was a rare occurrence, and a flicker of genuine warmth, of foolish hope, sparked within me. Maybe the porch was finally fixed. Maybe they'd bought that new appliance she'd been hinting at for years. I braced myself for a cheerful update, ready to share in their small victory. "Riley, darling," she practically chirped, and I could almost hear the smile in her voice, a stark contrast to the usual weary sigh. "Oh, I just had to tell you, your last transfer, it came at the perfect time. We used it for Liam's new Armani suit." The words hit me like a physical blow, a sudden, sharp intake of breath that left my lungs burning. Armani. For Liam. My mind reeled, trying to process the disconnect, the sheer, audacious audacity of it. Armani. I managed to croak, the single word barely a whisper. "Yes, darling, Armani," she continued, oblivious to the sudden chill that had permeated my end of the line. "He simply had to look impeccable for that networking event in New York. You know, the one with Senator Thompson and those venture capitalists? He couldn't possibly go in anything less than the best, and your timing was just divine. It fit him like a glove, absolutely exquisite. He looked so distinguished, so stone." She chuckled, a light, airy sound that grated on my ears. "He's already made such wonderful connections, darling. This is going to be huge for his career, truly huge for the family name." My heart, which had been a dull, aching throb since the mantelpiece revelation, now felt like it was being physically ripped apart. It wasn't just the money, though that was a significant amount. Money I had earned through long, grueling deployments, through risking my life in places most people only saw on the news. It was the absolute, unadulterated betrayal of my trust, of my intentions, of the quiet sacrifices I had made. All those years, all those transfers, all those mental images of groceries and repairs and practical necessities, they had been a delusion, a fantasy. My hard-earned money, money that could have gone to actual needs, to easing their burdens, had instead been funneled into Liam's meticulously crafted image, into a superficial display of wealth and status that served only to further his already privileged trajectory. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste on my tongue. I was out there in the dust and the danger, fighting for what exactly? So Liam could wear an expensive suit to a networking event? So he could look impeccable, while I was covered in grit and grime, making choices that were my burden, not theirs? The sheer, unthinking selfishness of it was breathtaking. My mother's cheerful voice continued to chatter about Liam's promising future, about the honor he was bringing to the family, completely oblivious, or perhaps willfully ignorant, of the chasm that had just opened up between us. My heart didn't just break. It shattered into a million tiny pieces, each one reflecting back the painful truth. I wasn't just a burden. I was a resource, a means to an end, a convenient ATM for Liam's ascent, my own needs and sacrifices utterly invisible, utterly irrelevant. The phone call ended, and I stood there, the receiver still pressed to my ear, listening to the hollow dial tone, the sound echoing the emptiness that had just consumed me. The quiet click of the phone disconnecting, the finality of that simple act, left a strange echo in the room, a silence that felt heavier, more profound than any noise could have been. It was the sound of a line drawn, a boundary finally established after years of erosion. The anger, the heartache, the bitter disillusionment from the Armani suit revelation had coalesced into a cold, hard resolve. I thought I had reached my limit, that the well of my emotional investment in them had finally run dry. But life, or rather, my family, always seemed to find new depths to plumb. A few days after my terse conversation with my father, a familiar chime startled me. It was the urgent alert of breaking news on my military-issued tablet, automatically tuned to major global networks. CNN. My stomach nodded instantly. Had they discovered my new boundary? Was this another public airing of family grievances? But it wasn't. The headline flashed across the screen, not about me, not about Liam, but about something far more significant, far more personal. It was about Operation Iron Echo. Operation Iron Echo wasn't just a military campaign. It was my life's work for the past year, the culmination of countless sleepless nights, intricate strategizing, and a dangerous, high-stakes implementation. It was my brainchild, my signature achievement, the very reason I had earned the rank and the recent media attention. It was the global AI counteroffensive, the intricate web of digital defenses and preemptive strikes that had averted a major cyber catastrophe, a silent war won in the shadows. And there, on the screen, was a man I recognized, a man I had known since childhood, sitting opposite the same news anchor who had announced my own rank just days before. It was my cousin, Ethan Waynes. Ethan, usually a loud, boisterous presence at family gatherings, was now remarkably subdued, his expression somber, almost reverent. The anchor introduced him as a key figure in the recent success of Operation Iron Echo. My blood ran cold. Ethan was a distant cousin, a civilian, a tech consultant who dabbled in cryptocurrency, not a military strategist. He knew absolutely nothing about Iron Echo, let alone its intricate mechanics or classified operations. And then he started to speak. His voice was hushed, trembling with what appeared to be raw emotion. He recounted details of the operation, details that were eerily accurate, details that only a handful of people knew. He spoke of the long hours, the immense pressure, the personal sacrifices he had made. He even choked up, his eyes welling with what looked suspiciously like fake tears, as he described the burden of leadership and the courage required to execute such a complex endeavor. He was presenting my story, my experience, my triumph, as his own. He was claiming credit for my brilliance, my risk, my everything. The sheer audacity of it left me speechless, my mind struggling to reconcile the Ethan I knew with the tearful imposter on my screen. This wasn't just a misattribution, it was a wholesale theft of my identity, my professional legacy. I felt a surge of nausea, a dizzying sense of disbelief. How was this even possible? Who would allow this? My phone rang again, pulling me from the sickening spectacle. It was my father. I answered, my voice tight with a dangerous calm. Did you see it? I asked, my words clipped. His response was immediate, laced with a familiar exasperation, as if I were the one being unreasonable. Yes, Riley, of course I saw it. It was magnificent. Ethan handled himself very well, very poised. Then, his voice dropped slightly, taking on that slightly patronizing, conspiratorial tone he reserved for family damage control. Look, I know what you're thinking, but it was necessary. This operation, this Iron Echo, it's giving the family a certain image. Liam is busy with his political aspirations, and frankly, you're not exactly suited for public relations, are you? Too blunt, too military. He paused, as if expecting me to concede, to understand. Ethan is presentable. He's charming. He can articulate the family's contribution in a way that resonates with the public. I authorized it for the family's image. The words echoed in my head, each one a hammer blow. The family's image. Not my truth. Not my sacrifice. Just their image. He had knowingly, willingly allowed my cousin to steal my greatest professional achievement, to parade it as his own, all for the sake of maintaining a flawless facade, a narrative of success that had no room for me, the actual architect of that success. It was a calculated, cold-blooded act of betrayal that went beyond financial exploitation, beyond emotional neglect. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was an erasure. This was them systematically trying to wipe me out of existence, to rewrite my story, to claim my victories as their own, while simultaneously dismissing me as too blunt, too military, not presentable. They weren't just calling me a burden. They were making me a ghost, a phantom in my own life, my contributions appropriated, my very being negated. And in that moment, watching Ethan shed his manufactured tears on national television, I realized the true depths of their depravity, the utter lack of regard they held for me, not just as a daughter, but as a human being. The bitterness of being erased, of having my life's work stolen and paraded by a charlatan like Ethan, festered into something cold and hard inside me. It was a wound that refused to heal, a constant reminder of how utterly disposable I was to them. Even my greatest achievements reduced to fodder for their carefully constructed public image. I thought I had learned to navigate their games, to anticipate their moves, but this was a new low, a deliberate attempt to make me disappear from my own narrative. Yet, even as the anger simmered, a strange clarity began to emerge. If they wanted to erase me, I would make sure they remembered exactly who I was. The military, a place that had always been my refuge, my escape from the Stone family's suffocating expectations, suddenly became another arena for their machinations. Not long after Ethan's performative display on CNN, the axe fell. I was officially suspended from duty. The charges were vague, yet damning. Allegations of leaking classified data. My stomach clenched, but there was no surprise. I knew, with an absolute, chilling certainty, what this was. This wasn't some random investigation. It was a targeted hit, a direct retaliation for exposing Kincaid. Kincaid. The name tasted like ash in my mouth. He was a high-ranking official, seemingly untouchable, who had been orchestrating a dangerous, deeply unethical data exploitation scheme within our very own systems, cloaked under layers of national security. I had spent months meticulously gathering evidence, risking my career, my reputation, my very freedom, to expose him. It was the right thing to do, the only thing to do, but I knew it would have consequences. I just hadn't expected them to be quite so personal, quite so intertwined with the venomous tendrils of my own family. The timing was too perfect, the accusation too convenient. This wasn't justice. It was a coordinated strike, designed not just to sideline me, but to utterly discredit me, to bury me under a mountain of fabricated scandal. The message was clear: disappear. Fade into the background. Accept your fate as the disgraced general, the pariah. They wanted me to vanish quietly, to let the narrative of my betrayal cement itself, further cementing their narrative of flawless virtue. They wanted me to crumble under the pressure, to retreat into obscurity. But something snapped. The years of quiet resentment, the constant feeling of being overlooked, undervalued, and now, outright erased, boiled over. The attic box, the stolen photograph, the Armani suit, Ethan's performative tears, my father's cold authorization, it all culminated in a single, burning realization: I was done playing by their rules. I was done being the silent victim, the convenient scapegoat, the forgotten daughter. Disappear? No, I would not disappear. I would explode. The military had taught me to be strategic, to identify weaknesses, to exploit vulnerabilities. My family and their powerful allies thought they had trapped me, but they had underestimated one crucial thing. My network extended far beyond their gilded cages. My phone was dead silent for days, but my secure channels buzzed. I reached out to the one person I knew who could help, someone I trusted implicitly, a ghost in the machine who operated far outside the conventional structures of power. Spectre. Spectre wasn't just a hacker. They were a legend, an elusive digital phantom capable of navigating the darkest corners of the internet with unparalleled skill. They owed me a favor, a big one, from a classified operation years ago that had saved their digital skin. I laid it all out. The Kincaid corruption, the manufactured charges against me, the Stone family's complicity, their relentless efforts to control and manipulate narratives, to erase anyone who didn't fit their perfect mold. I explained that this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about exposing a deeply entrenched network of corruption, a conspiracy that reached into the highest echelons of power, enabled by the very people who claimed to uphold honor and integrity. The response was swift, concise. Consider it done. Give me targets. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing out encrypted commands, laying the groundwork for a counteroffensive of a different kind. This wouldn't be a quiet whimper. It would be a digital scream heard around the world. They wanted to accuse me of leaking data? Fine. I would give them a leak that would drown them. I would expose the entire web of their conspiracy, the backroom deals, the hidden financial trails, the true extent of Kincaid's operations, and the insidious ways my family leveraged their influence to protect their image and their assets at any cost. This wasn't just about clearing my name. It was about tearing down the rotten edifice they had built, brick by painstakingly stolen brick. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for the truth, for every other burden and inconvenience they had systematically crushed. The game had changed, and this time, I was playing to win. The air in the hearing room on Capitol Hill was thick with anticipation, a palpable hum of nervous energy, and the low murmur of journalists, strategists, and politicians. The room itself was imposing, all polished wood and stern faces, designed to convey authority and gravity. Cameras were positioned strategically, their red lights blinking, broadcasting this spectacle to a world eager for scandal and drama. I sat at the witness table, facing a panel of grim-faced senators, my military uniform crisp, devoid of any visible rank, a silent testament to my suspended status. Yet, for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt no fear, no self-doubt, only a cold, unwavering clarity. My family, or what remained of them, sat in the front row, a united front of stony silence, their faces carefully neutral, but I could feel their collective gaze, sharp with a desperate hope that I would somehow falter, that I would break. Beside them sat Ethan, looking considerably less poised than he had on CNN, his previous bravado replaced by a nervous fidgeting. Liam was there too, his usual confident demeanor now tinged with a visible pallor. And at the center, my father, Arthur Stone, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on me with a chilling intensity that I had once mistaken for concern, but now recognized as pure, unadulterated control. They thought they had orchestrated my downfall, that my career was over, that I was just another inconvenient truth they could sweep under the rug. They were wrong. The questioning began, a relentless barrage of carefully worded inquiries about the alleged data leak, about my unstable behavior, about my unconventional choices. Each question was a thinly veiled attempt to reinforce the narrative they had constructed, that I was reckless, unreliable, and ultimately a liability. But I had prepared. Spectre's work had been meticulous, exposing layers of deceit that even I hadn't fully grasped. When it was my turn to speak, a hush fell over the room. I looked directly into the lens of the nearest camera, knowing that my words weren't just for the people in this room, but for every individual who had ever been dismissed, undermined, or erased. For years, I began, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the tense silence. My family has cultivated an image of unblemished success, of integrity, of honor. But that image, like so many others, is a carefully constructed lie. And I am here today, not as an accused, but as the proof you chose to ignore. Then, I started to lay it all bare. I revealed the meticulous financial records Spectre had uncovered, direct evidence of bribes funneled from Kincaid's shadowy organizations into shell corporations linked directly to Liam's political campaigns, and, more disturbingly, to my father's seemingly legitimate business ventures. The senator overseeing Liam's recent fundraiser shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I presented the decrypted communications, the damning emails and messages that detailed how my family, specifically my father and Liam, had actively orchestrated a campaign of media manipulation. I showed how they had paid off journalists, planted false stories, and suppressed any information that might tarnish their pristine public image, including the meticulous discrediting of whistleblowers and the insidious promotion of Ethan as the face of Operation Iron Echo. The room gasped, a collective intake of breath that echoed through the loudspeakers. Ethan visibly paled, sinking lower in his chair. And finally, I continued, my gaze sweeping over my father's rigid face. I have here a document that speaks volumes about the true nature of their disdain, their calculated cruelty. I held up a laminated sheet, its corners slightly curled, an almost identical twin to the ones in my attic box. This is a psychological profile, compiled by a supposed expert, which my father submitted to the military as part of the formal process to facilitate my administrative discharge, what you were calling a suspension due to leaks. This profile was designed to paint me as emotionally unstable, prone to reckless behavior, and psychologically unfit for command. I paused, allowing the weight of the revelation to settle. It states, unequivocally, that I possess a fundamental inability to align personal ambition with familial duty, and that my stubborn independence poses a significant threat to established hierarchical structures. The words, chillingly familiar, were a mirror of every casual insult, every subtle put-down I had endured for decades. It was their official, written justification for my erasure. My father's face, which had been a mask of carefully controlled anger, finally cracked. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Liam stared at the table, refusing to meet my eyes. Ethan looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. I leaned forward, my voice dropping slightly, but gaining an undeniable force, each word imbued with years of silent suffering and now, defiant truth. They said my choices were my burden. They call me selfish. They tried to erase my existence, to steal my accomplishments, to discredit my character. They tried to break me, to make me disappear into the shadows of their carefully constructed narrative. My gaze locked onto my father's, holding it firmly. But you all underestimated me. The silence in the room was absolute, punctuated only by the whirring of the cameras. This isn't just my story, I concluded, my voice resonating with a quiet power that commanded attention. This is the story of every truth you tried to bury, every voice you tried to silence, every individual you deemed inconvenient for your image. This is not my burden anymore. I gestured broadly, encompassing the entire room, the cameras, the shocked faces, the disgraced figures in the front row. This is your legacy. And with that, I simply sat back, the weight of years of injustice lifted, replaced by the profound, exhilarating lightness of truth finally spoken, a powerful, indelible mark left on the world they had so desperately tried to control. My part was done. The explosion had begun. The reverberations from the Capitol Hill hearing were swift and devastating. The carefully constructed edifice of the Stone family's reputation, once thought impregnable, crumbled under the weight of Spectre's irrefutable evidence and my unvarnished truth. The news cycles were relentless, feeding on the scandal, dissecting every revelation. The giants, as they were once considered, fell with a resounding crash that echoed through political corridors and corporate boardrooms alike. Kincaid, the corrupt official whose intricate web of deceit I had exposed, was not just dismissed. He was arrested, his entire operation dismantled. His empire of data exploitation, built on secrecy and manipulation, collapsed. My cousin, Ethan, the tearful imposter who had so blithely claimed my achievements, was summarily expelled from his university, his budding tech career utterly incinerated before it could even properly begin. The networking event that the Armani suit was bought for became a footnote in his public humiliation, his carefully curated image of a rising star shattered beyond repair. And Liam, the golden child, the presumptive heir to the Stone legacy, found his political aspirations not just stalled, but irrevocably tainted. The bribery scandal, the media manipulation, the sheer audacity of his complicity made him a pariah. His perfectly polished life became a public spectacle of disgrace, and he was quietly, yet effectively, transferred to some obscure, remote corporate division, far from the public eye, far from any real influence. My father, Arthur Stone, saw his business interests come under intense scrutiny, his carefully managed empire facing audits and investigations that would likely unravel decades of questionable dealings. This Stone name, once a symbol of unassailable prestige, now carried the heavy scent of scandal and corruption. The military, predictably, moved quickly to rectify their error. The suspension was lifted, the charges of leaking data officially retracted, attributed instead to a misinformation campaign orchestrated by Kincaid's network, implicitly acknowledging the Stone family's role without explicitly naming them in the official report. My record was cleared, my reputation restored. Offers of promotion came swiftly, a rapid ascent through the ranks, recognition for my strategic genius and unwavering integrity. The very system that had tried to silence me now sought to embrace me, to parade me as a symbol of their own resilience. But I declined. Every offer, every commendation, every step up the ladder that would once have seemed like the ultimate validation, now felt hollow. The idea of returning to that structure, even in a position of greater power, after what I had witnessed, what I had endured, felt like a compromise I was no longer willing to make. My fight wasn't about rank or prestige within an existing system. It was about something far more fundamental. I took the full extent of my earnings, my accumulated military pay that had once been siphoned off for Armani suits and family facades, and I made a different kind of investment. I bought land, a significant parcel of untouched wilderness far from the manicured lawns and stifling opulence of the Stone estate. It was rugged, untamed, with clear streams and ancient trees, a place where the air felt clean, untainted by deceit. And there, from the ground up, I began to build. It wasn't a corporate office, not a military base, but something entirely new, something rooted in the lessons I had learned from the brutal crucible of my past. I founded the Stone Institute for Honorable Leadership. The irony of the name wasn't lost on me. It was a reclaiming, a defiant act of redefinition. This wouldn't be a place built on the false legacies of the past, not carved in marble or polished to an artificial sheen.